controversial podcast where we talk about the current state of climate change and mitigation efforts that could be done today. Today, I have a special guest speaker with us, Aravind, who is our, well, I guess I can call him an Earth observation influencer, who is also running a very well-known geospatial consultancy, Earth observation consultancy called TerraWatch Space. And he is also the expert who is currently helping us write a white paper on the subject of the current basically tech stack landscape when it comes to nature and climate monitoring through remote sensing solutions. So I'm very excited to have him here today. I'm gonna have him a chance to say a few words about himself as well.
Sure, thanks, Olya. Hi, my name is Aravind. I'm the founder of TerraWatch Space, as you just mentioned. So I work with Earth observation companies, space agencies, and end users of Earth observation on a lot of strategic projects. You know, whether it's go-to-market strategy, market analysis, investors' due diligence, strategy for adopting Earth observation for end users. So a lot of strategic projects. I've been running TerraWatch for the last couple of years. So that's a quick background about myself.
He's also got a really cool newsletter that you should check out if you would like to stay up to date with everything that pertains to technology and Earth observation. And since he is the literal expert in that, I think the first question that I would like to ask him is, Aravind, on the scale of nice have to critical, how would you rate the importance of satellite-based data when it comes to climate mitigation?
Yeah, obviously it's on the critical side. I think that's quite obvious to us within the industry, but then I think for people outside, it's not been that that easy to understand. But yeah, I would say it's critical.
So would you be able to develop that a little better? Because I think a lot of people are missing the context because they don't know about all of the applications of satellite imagery. I think what most people are familiar with right now is something like, oh, hey, let's look if there is some forest that was cut down somewhere on Earth, or let's look at the latest mapping of X, Y, and Z. But can you maybe bring some specific examples that can basically tell us a different story about the climate change and the role of remote sensing in it?
Yeah, for sure. I think, when I think about Earth observation, you should know that from a satellite point of view, I include both imaging satellites, satellites that look at the ocean, satellites that look at the land, and satellites that look at the atmosphere all together, because, they're all sensing the Earth remotely, so it's part of the same deal. So I think it should be quite obvious that for a lot of people, the manifestation of climate change in the world is through weather. So for any sort of weather-related event, you use already satellite data as 80% of the forecast. It's part of 80% of weather forecasts in general. So I think the use of satellites is already there, that we're using every day, and we're going to be using more and more when it comes to adapting to climate. But then, that's more to do with immediately adapting to climate change. But then if you have to look at long-term adoption of climate change, climate adaptation, then it becomes obvious that, we need data points that are collected over a period of years in order to understand how the future is going to be. So, example, you take flood. Is that building is the place where I'm constructing my new asset, whether you're a real estate, whether you're a bank, whether you're an insurance company, you need to know the answer to that question. Whether it's easy, is it going to rain tomorrow or not? Mm-hmm. But then is that place going to be more flood prone in 6, 7, 8, 9 years? And to answer that question, you need a lot of historical data, and that's what satellites allow us to do, right? So satellites are up there collecting data all the time, and meaning you have record of the data that has happened for land from a satellite point of view. We've had for 50, 60 years. And for monitoring the land, we have it for almost 40, 45 years with Landsat, which is a program from the US. With Sentinels, been around for almost, give or take 10 years. So we've had a lot of data, which allow us to kind of see the pattern and then help us predict, right? So that's basically data-driven modeling. And, flood is just one use case. You can look at that for any sort of physical climate risk if you want, whether it's flood, drought, wildfire, And every one of these are kind of almost umbrella terms, because you want to look at if there is a potential for wildfire or not. Like you said, you can find out if there is trees here or not, right? Like that's what people think and understand.
Right.
But then what satellites can also do is also identify, is that tree more prone to wildfire compared to another type of tree? Because guess what, we can also classify different type of trees with satellite imagery, which means that you can look at a forest, see what the forest is made of, what type of trees, and then we have data to say that these type of trees that look drier are probably more likely to be prone to wildfire than another type of tree, right? So that's a completely different application, but then it all falls under the wildfire. So if you're going to say that if this place is from a scale of 1 to 10, the wildfire risk is 8, all of these factors come in, right? Like, how was the weather in that area for the last 10 years? So all of this information comes together, and satellite data plays a big part. That's just only on the, let's say, on the adaptation side. On the mitigation side, maybe we'll talk about emissions. How are we making sure that we're actually getting out of climate change is actually measuring global emission levels on a national level, but also on a global level, to make sure that we're actually doing things, or whatever we are doing, is it working or not? From a mitigation point of view, that's also through satellites. So yeah, I think satellites have a huge role across different use cases and different sectors as well.
So you mentioned there are different missions when it comes to constellations. So are most of the missions having global coverage, or is it just national coverage?
Yeah, I think there are both, actually, because obviously the space industry has evolved over the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years. Countries are now interested in also launching their own missions. Also, there are global missions as well. So if you look at some scientific missions that are looking at monitoring the emissions, for instance, which is Sentinel-5P, is a satellite that can monitor all types of emissions, greenhouse gases, aerosols, air pollution, a lot of aspects of, let's say, the atmosphere. And it is global. It's a global mission. But I think what we will also probably start seeing, and we're probably already seeing now, is countries are also interested in investing in their own assets. So we will also get, country level, high resolution forecasts, and that's more on the governmental side. And if you look at the company side, obviously there are several companies today that are, launching satellites, that have plans to launch satellites, and they go for mostly a global coverage because, as companies, they target the global market. There are at least 3-4 companies today that are looking at just emission monitoring as a space that they're targeting. So they're going to launch emission monitoring satellites globally. So first it was methane, next is CO2. Those are the two most important gases that we need to monitor. So there are a lot of satellites both on a global and a national level.
So in your estimation, is it plausible that when those more sophisticated emissions monitoring satellites launch, we're going to get a completely different answer to the state of, the climate change that's associated with those emissions?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think we already have some data to prove that we have been underestimating our emissions. With methane, actually, it's been very obvious, because methane is a gas that escapes and kind of flows very freely in the atmosphere. So it would be very hard to even figure out where this methane emission came from. But with satellites, they already provide a big picture, right? Like with, this methane emission happened in this area, in this country. We're able to pinpoint, because satellites can just see that signature and observe that. So that is already providing a big difference for methane emissions. But then overall, in general, for emissions, I think we have been underestimating, predominantly because the way the emissions have been taken, or let's say the emission stock take was done, was mainly through in situ sensors and proxies. So in situ sensors, sensors installed locally, and coupled with a few airborne, let's say, flight-based measurement. That's how emission has been done so far. So today the Paris Agreement that we've had for the last 8 years, that is used to track, it's like a climate policy for globally. It does not use satellite-based measurements. So it uses data from proxies, it uses data from different sensors, but does not use from satellites. So I think it's quite obvious. I mean, it's logical to think, and I think we will have science and scientific papers coming up once these missions are launched to prove that point, but then it's just logical to think that we have now an ability to measure something globally on a global scale at a low resolution, right? Like missions from ESA, NASA, JAXA, etc. will measure it on local, let's say on a high level. And then there are commercial companies that are also launching missions that will look at emissions from a local level. So if you put that together, I think it's logical to assume that we will have a big difference in terms of how we have calculated emissions. How big, we don't know, but I think the difference will definitely be big, just logically thinking, because you look at several countries in the world which do not have the mechanism to do this offset, right?
Yeah.
So I think it becomes logical that it's what's going to happen.
So when you say, like mapping emissions on the local level, can it be like as precise as measuring emissions of a certain, say, factory or something like that, or is it still like municipality level?
So I think the commercial satellites are definitely focused on factory level, asset level emissions, simply because they need to differentiate with the data from space agency missions. So I think the commercial satellites, and also there are a couple of other let's say non-profit missions as well coming up, at least for emission monitoring, methane sat and carbon mapper, so focused on carbon dioxide and methane mapping, which will have asset level data on also as an open data set. So all of this is going to be very, very useful information for us to even identify, what's the level of climate change and how much, as we discussed, how worse it actually is, which is not a great thought.
Right. I'm not sure I'm ready for that depressing information. But attached to that, I have another question. So I think most of our listeners at this point are familiar with EUDR, so European Union anti-deforestation regulation, which a lot of people are estimating is like the first step when it comes to including satellite data into, I guess, like bigger ESG reporting. Do you think this is something that's going to be coming up in the nearest future? So specifically for emissions, will the regulators be mandating this objective data to verify, like you said, their in situ measurements?
Yeah, I think that's going to happen. So only just from the perspective of emissions, I don't know if we have a rule specifically focused on emissions just yet, but I know that California in the US has that regulation that has come up. I think maybe people need to report it indirectly, especially as part of the sustainability directive in the EU. It can become important for companies to justify, why the level of emissions is this much. And I don't think they've found any clarity on what and how much this actually is required from the company. I think these are all probably will learn as the regulation is being implemented, because the regulation is still written on a very high level, or at least I feel like, which is not great because it leaves things open. But I think it's probably a strategy for them, because you don't want to be a government and mandate that something needs to be reported where you have no way to report it. So
right.
Maybe I think it will happen inevitably, which I think is probably going to be obvious, right? Like almost like how climate risk is necessary, right? Like it's a necessary component for a company to function, because if you're an investor investing in the company, buying the stock of a company, you need to know if this company is going to exist in 5 years or 10 years, or if there's going to be a huge flood event that's going to kind of destroy most of its assets. And the same thing is true for emissions as well. So I think it will become almost a commercial requirement. Policy, of course, is one thing, but then I think it's also becoming also commercially important. And I think it can kind of, draw parallels with deforestation in one way, where even as consumers, maybe we don't want to make a choice of, buying products from companies that are deforesting more than those that don't, right? So I think there's going to be a lot of factors that come in and push towards the regulation. It's not just going to be government mandated, so they're going to report it. I think it's going to have a larger necessity for that as well.
All right. Yeah. So I think I would like to again develop on what you just said, or rather ask another question. So you said, we cannot ask companies to report on something if it's like not clear whether they can actually do it or not. So that brings me to the question of the tech stack. So both in terms of, I guess, the satellites that are out there, and the tech that's supposed to take the information and make it available to those companies as end users who are supposed to use the data. Do you think the current landscape from hardware and software perspective is good enough, bad? Like, where is it from your perspective, and where do we need to be?
I think from a data point of view, I think we are probably good to start with, just because we've been collecting data, like I said, for 40, 50 years now. So I think it would be wrong to just say that we have all the data we need. Maybe there's probably data that we don't have, right? Like, for example, to classify all the types of trees. Well, I don't know if we need to classify every type of tree, but let's say wildfire is probably caused by certain type of trees, and do we have the ability to identify and classify all the types of data, all trees? Maybe not. Maybe we need more hyperspectral imagery for that. Right? Like, hyperspectral imagery helps us classify trees. So just one example. But I think on the whole, I think we don't have to wait. That's probably what I'd say. We have enough data that is available for free that we can exploit to derive insights. Just because of all the programs we've launched over the 40, 50 years. So I think from a data point of view, we are good. I think what we probably have gaps in is more on the platform layer, and let's say on the third layer, which is more related to the products and the applications that provide the insights. So from a platform perspective, I think it's more about having the right platform that can serve users who don't want to buy the data or who are not interested or who don't know how to use the data, because remote sensing is a domain. So you need to have platforms that enable folks to derive insights as easily as possible, because that's the role of the platforms. And also from an application point of view on the third layer, I think it's again, there are companies that are coming up. It's probably going to become the hottest area in our sector in the next few years, because there are so many applications of EO that we have not exploited, that we have not developed applications on, especially that can be deployed in a scalable way. So I think we will have a lot of applications, and we've started seeing emergence of platforms such as Orbify and several others, which are focused on solving this problem of let's make let's make people get things out of Earth observation without really knowing remote sensing, just knowing what they need, because that's basically where the gap is. And I think that's what we have to figure out more in the next few years.
And I think attached to that is another issue that I think companies like ours are feeling firsthand, is like this whole chicken or the egg problem. So you, as somebody who gets it, quote unquote, how critical it is to use the Earth observation data. But most of the companies out there still, some of them don't even know it exists, and others only see it as a nice have. So that's why I asked you about the regulation question earlier on, because I'm like, should there be more regulation first so that companies actually are mandated to use it, or should the tech be there first? But then comes the question, like, who's going to finance all of this? Because investors have the same question, right? Like, is this actually going to be a viable market?
Yeah, but I think I have kind of I don't know if it's another opinion, but then it's more of a different perspective, because I think regulation is probably just one driver, and I don't think we can wait for the regulation driver or depend on the regulation driver too much, simply because a lot of companies will see it as an overhead. It's something that they have to do, so they will not want to spend a lot of money on it. They will want to do it in a very bare minimum way. Which is not really great for the sector, right? Like, maybe they'll just say, I don't know, my wildfire risk is pretty low because, I don't have a lot of assets in areas, or flood risk, for instance. I don't have a lot of assets in areas which are flood prone. Maybe they'll stop there. Maybe they won't give a lot more information because the regulation did not ask them to. I think we also have to realize that regulation is just only one of the drivers. And I think our data is more than capable of acting as a value driver, meaning not just a regulation, need, but actually a value driver, right? Like, if you're an insurance company, if you don't have this data and you don't have this integrated into your data set, your regular insurance model is not going to work. You cannot work without having this data. So it's almost like our data is going to create more value, new value that they need in order to survive in the new reality with climate change, because without this, they cannot improve their products, right? So this is just one example in insurance. You look at, I don't know, for commodity traders. So if you want to actually know if there's going to be agricultural output in an area, like how do you find that out? Maybe 5 years ago you didn't need to, but then we have entered an age where maybe this year the yield is great, but then the next year the yield is not that great. But how are you going to know that in advance in order for you to plan as a company? Same applies for the agriculture sector. So I think for a lot of sectors, you have to also push this as a value driver, because there's a lot of value to be had, and not just be kind of segmented into, oh, this is a tool that is going to help us prepare the report that we have to submit to the commission or to the local regulation authority. That's also one use case, but I think the value driver part also we shouldn't forget.
You're completely right. And I think the last question would have been, and it would have been because it's actually going to be answered in the white paper that you're working, and also in the webinar where you're going to present the white papers. Basically, what we get from, a lot of our, I guess at this point, clients and prospects is, okay, so how do I make sure I choose, the best resource when it comes to Earth observation data? Should I deal with raw data? Should I deal with the, kind of like a platform or vertical application? But that's why we're all excited about the upcoming white paper, because it's going to provide that answer. Thank you so much for your time today, Aravind. We're going to tag your LinkedIn profile as well as, the link to your website in the description of this episode. Are there any last words that you would like to share with the listeners?
Well, I'd probably just say that there are probably use cases of satellite data that we don't know about. I think that's what we're excited about, especially when we combine satellite data with other types of data. I think that's probably where a lot of the new applications of satellite data will come from, and I think we have only just started scratching the surface.
Literally and figuratively, I guess.
Yep.
All right.